Hello and welcome to the Ancient Warfare Podcast. I'm Marc De Santis, and today I'll be talking with historian Murray Dahm about his latest book, Roman Soldier versus Dacian Warrior, Dacian Wars AD 85 to 106. Greetings, Murray. How are you doing?
Very well, very well.
So your book is number 80 of the combat series from Osprey.
Yes.
Let's get started and begin with the most basic of questions. What were the Dacian Wars?
So the Dacian Wars, I think if you say Dacian Wars to most people, even uninitiated non-Roman military historians, they've seen a giant column in the Forum of Trajan in Rome, and they know that Trajan's column records Trajan's Dacian Wars. And so I think to most people, when you say Dacian Wars, it's Trajan's Dacian Wars, which were fought two campaigns fought between 101 and 106 AD. He goes into Dacia twice, wins one war, makes peace. The king of the Dacians, Decebalus, although some people think that that's a title rather than a name, he makes peace, breaks the peace, and then there's a second campaign, which creates the province of Dacia in the aftermath of that second war. Now, one of the points I wanted to make in the book was that Trajan is not the end point of the Dacian Wars. There continue to be wars fought in Dacia, nor is he the beginning point. It's not come out of the blue, his invasion in 101. So, in fact, the Dacians have a whole record of contact with Rome going back into the age of even prior to Augustus. But the big indicator that there is a campaign to be held in Dacia is under the reign of Domitian. And so there's the Domitianic Dacian Wars from about 85 to 88 AD is, I think, a precursor to Trajan's Wars, shows Trajan what is achievable. And also, I think, I make the argument in the book that the mistakes Domitian makes, Trajan doesn't fall into the same mistakes. And I think I've been watching too much on Chernobyl. It's kind of a void coefficient that the lack of things that Domitian does or mistakes he makes make Trajan do the opposite. And so it's a fascinating set of conflicts to look at, because some of the men, of course, who by this point in time are serving for 25 years or more, we do have several legionaries who finish their enlistment and then re-enlist. So, we've got a couple of individuals from inscriptions who serve in both campaigns, which is fascinating.
And who were the Dacians? Standard barbarian peoples on the frontier? What was their homeland like? Was it especially difficult terrain? Were they tough?
Well,
okay.
Yes. So what you've got is, for lack of a better term, Dacia is essentially modern Romania, but there are caveats to that. There is confusion in the sources and even in the archaeology about the Dacians, the Getae, the Dacio-Getae. Are they subsets of one another? Are they, an amalgamation? Are the Getae Dacian? Are the Dacians Getae? There's all sorts of, the Sarmatai. The ancient sources use a whole bunch of different terms, including Scythian, to say the same groups of people, which is kind of, well, hang on, which one are they? And there's tribes within that, of course, as well, which every now and then you'll get a tribal name thrown in, which is like, hang on, who are they? And so what we've got is north of the Danube, stretching from the Carpathian Mountains across to the Black Sea, is generally a Dacian area or ghetto-Dacian area. You've got, in the time of Julius Caesar, again, no Dacian sources survive. So we're dealing with Greek and Roman sources, which can be misleading, and archaeology, which is not misleading, but it certainly doesn't necessarily tie in to what we know from literature, which are that there's four kingdoms, and they're combined by Burebista, and then that's an empire which rivals Rome's empire, which is like, wow, it's a massive, important culture north of the Danube. That then falls apart, and there's civil war, and they don't then split out into the same tribes that Burebista combined. These four and eventually two kind of rival claimants, and of course we think of the borders as being like modern borders being, well, that's a border, and they're not. They're permeable. They're vague. We talk about, well, it's the Danube, but there are Dacians south of the Danube as well. There are, of course, points where Rome moves populations around, and so you find that there are people of the same culture on both sides, both banks of the Danube, which is meant to create an affinity culturally between those people. So therefore, cross-river raids, which seem to be the main pretext of invasion and war, don't occur because you're attacking your own people or people of your own culture. It doesn't tend to work. It's like, wow, we're going to put more Dacians on, 50,000 Dacians on the southern border of the Danube. No one will attack them. Oh, they attack them. Okay, what happened there then? So it's fascinating, all of that, the permutations of borders.
So there was a problem, a security problem along the Danubian frontier for the Romans,
Yes.
and they had to figure out some way to deal with it. And that brings us to, the latter part of the first century AD. So let me see if I can set this up. Typically speaking, historians of the Roman imperial army would say that the army of the late first, early second centuries was the very best version of the Roman army. So this is when it was at its highest point of efficiency. What are the sources that we have for the wars that were fought at this time? Because there's obviously some deficits there, at least literary deficits. Go ahead.
Nicely put. Absolutely. We are robbed of a fully surviving continuous historical narrative of these wars. They existed and are lost. We had some poetry that was written. Domitian, of course, is a problem because Domitian is a tyrant. Domitian suffers from damnatio memoriae after he's dead. Domitian could achieve nothing positive in the picture that we get in the reigns of Nerva, Trajan, Antoninus Pius, and Hadrian. That image is problematic because we know Domitian was popular amongst the soldiers. He gives them a pay rise. He's the first to do so since the Julio-Claudians. He's the last to do so until Septimius Severus. So, Dio Chrysostom tells us that he talks the soldiers on this Danubian Dacian border down from a mutiny when the assassination of Domitian is announced. And, it's like, why is he popular with the soldiers? What's going on? So
especially since his reputation among later Roman historians is so poor.
Absolutely. And one of the interesting issues is that Domitian is on the front in the Dacian Wars with the troops. And of course, most modern historians go, he says he was there, but he wasn't doing anything. He was living it up on, in the palaces. Trajan also, in those sources which are deficient, was at the front. He was leading from the front. He was a real man. He was fighting. Like, hang on, they're both at the front. You can't have one because we think he's a good emperor being a positive, proper soldier, and one because we think he's a bad emperor being a terrible, unproper soldier. They're either both of them are good soldiers at the front, or they're either both wastrels and they're fighting the wars through their subordinates, which both did. So, not to mention, Domitian's subordinates, who are all lambasted by Juvenal in Satire 4, they're all very experienced men. So anyway, so we don't have a historical narrative of these wars. We have some fragments in Dio Cassius and some other fragments. Trajan himself wrote an account of his Dacian Wars. Amazing. Where is it? 6 words survive. 6 words.
I find it extraordinary that the words of an emperor about an important
Claudius
war
gone.
Gone.
Yeah. And the 6 words are, I think 3 of them are locations. So essentially they translate from there to there to there. And that's it. I think I make a great deal of those 6 words in the text. Like, well, this could mean this. This tells us this. Which, when you think about it, is amazing because we don't normally go into such waxing lyrical detail on any other 6 words. But when they're the only 6 words, you've got to extrapolate what they might mean. So we don't have a continuous historical narrative. We've got summaries. We've got fragments. We then have the secondary literature, which in normal circumstances is only going to be a a footnote to our historical narrative. But when there is no historical narrative, Juvenal, Silius Italicus, a couple of other, the stratagems of Frontinus, a couple of other works by Frontinus, who's, of course, working and writing in the reign of Domitian, and isn't damned along with his emperor when the new emperors come in 96 and 97. He seems to be highly honoured by both Nerva and Trajan. And there isn't enough evidence to suggest it, but I think that probably Frontinus is the one advising Trajan about how to engage in a Dacian war properly.
He's learned some very good lessons, hard lessons.
Absolutely, he served Domitian in that period, and saw what mistakes were being made. Was probably responsible for the German limes.
The literary sources are very limited.
Yes,
much to it's a sad loss. But what about pictorial and archaeological sources? So there's Trajan's column, and then there's what the shovel can tell us.
Absolutely. Well, the shovel tells us a great deal from the Roman perspective, obviously, because we're dealing here with the classic Roman legionary that we see in every filmic depiction of Roman legionaries. It's like, hang on, no, they're in a much tighter window than you think, but we're dealing with the late 1st century, early 2nd century Roman legionary, the one with the lorica segmentata and the curved rectangular shield, and the gladius and the pilum, which, of course, aren't necessarily true either, because lorica segmentata perhaps was not as ubiquitous as we're told, that scale armor and mail armor were being used at the same time. You've got the manica, not on Trajan's column, but from the funerary monument at Adam Clissi, which has a much more veristic kind of depiction of the Roman legionary. But again, that doesn't work now, because the best surviving example of the manica for the right arm is from the Teutoburg forest,
which is about a century earlier than this.
Than
so
we
right.
say. So the old-fashioned arguments are that because of the Dacian falx, the two-handed and one-handed curved blade of the Dacians, it was so fearsome that they introduced manica onto the legionaries' arms to protect them. It's like, but if it's from 9 AD, this best example, it clearly was around for a lot longer before that, and it's not a response to the Dacian falx. It was there as a possibility already for anyone else striking the right arms of Roman legionaries. So, and getting back, of course, to that, is that the literary sources around them, not just the poetry. You've got a bracketing of the Dacian Wars by Josephus, who is, of course, writing a history of the Jewish War, which ends in 70-ish, 74, but he's writing under Domitian probably, depends, sometime under the Flavians, but at least he's writing a decade before the Dacian Wars of Domitian start. So perhaps if there's a doctrine under Flavian army practice, he captures it. And so I've used Josephus's marching order, and I've used Josephus's drawing up of the legion, which he describes. At the other end, you've got Arrian, who describes the Roman a campaign in 135 AD. So you've got one a decade before and one 30 years later, which there are differences between the two. And the problem is that Josephus and Arrian are the best descriptions of the marching order of the Roman legion. So it's like, well, if we look at the two, we can use one. And I've gone with Josephus to give us more detail. And of course, Jordanes, Getica, is a late source, a 5th century source, but he goes into details on this because for him, Goths is a very wide, so he includes a history of the Dacians under his history of the Goths, which is problematic. Now, getting back to archaeology. So you've got these amazing monuments in Trajan's column and the Adam Clissi monument. You've got other inscriptional evidence of veterans from these legions at the time and auxiliaries. And in fact, we've got a huge amount of detail in an inscription, and what that inscription tells us, about capturing Decebalus and all of this isn't in the literary sources. So you've got this amazingly corroborative archaeological evidence. Romania has an archaeological trove all its own. It's got these fortresses in modern-day Carpathian mountains and Transylvania, which are phenomenal. A lot of them are not fully excavated. A lot of them are excavated and published in Romanian only. And so what English language modern analyses of these digs is available, I did read for this and turn into what can we say about the arms of the Dacians. Because again, the sources, so Trajan's column, for instance, there's not a single falx on the column. It's like, well, what do the Dacians fight with? Well, they fight with normal swords, normal swords. And so, again, Adam Clissie has these falx armed troops. It's also got men with the Swabian knot on their heads, which, again, people say, oh, they're not Dacians. It's a different tribe. It's a different battle being described. And it's tricky, again, from later. And from my last Osprey book on Marcus Aurelius's wars against the Marcomanni, the Romans say, look, anyone could tie their hair in a Swabian knot. We can't tell the difference between a Marcomanni, a Dacian, a Quadi, a Carpi. They can, but to us, they're all the same. And if you dress like one of the others, you can pass in Roman market towns with undetected. And that's a similar picture to Ovid. So again, that's another source we can use is the speeches of Dio Chrysostom and the poetry of Ovid, especially the poetry in exile, where he's on the he's on the at Tomis up in the Ukraine on the border of the Black Sea between 8 and 17 AD. And the picture he paints is really useful because he says that the Dacians use cavalry a lot, and B, he says that they use arrows and they use poison arrows. He's the only source that tells us about poisoned arrows. But the idea of that many variances in weaponry, so that, cavalry, of course they use cavalry. They have raids over the Danube. They're raiding. And again, Trajan's column doesn't show Dacian cavalry. And yet when we look at the archaeological record, there are horse trappings in the archaeological record in modern Romania. There are evidence of archery being far more prevalent than the literature or the archaeology of Rome would give you. And so, yes, you have falx blades. Yes, you have sika, which are small curved blades. That seems everybody had a sika blade, or maybe a rite of passage for young men to have one or be given one.
So much of what we think we know about the Roman army of the High Empire, let's call it, comes from Trajan's column, whether it's the distinction between how the legionaries with the lorica segmentata, the auxiliaries wearing a short chain mail shirt, the praetorians, how the barbarians looked, what kind of weapons were used. It comes from that. And yet there's also this counter narrative that says that the sculptors of Trajan's column may not have ever seen up close the soldiers at the front. And is it still worthwhile, would you say? Is it a window?
Absolutely, it's a window, but I think the artistic license, the shields are not the right scale. Again, we have the problem that we only have one shield from Dura Europus from 256 AD, but from other depictions, they're far more covering than the Roman shields shown on Trajan's column, which seem to be more along, oh, well, it's the shield. We all know what a Roman legionary shield looks like. And if I drew them correctly, we wouldn't see anybody. So, there's a fabulous piece from Glanum, which shows a much longer, much more protective shield. Like, that's what they wore. But, and the ubiquity of the lorica segmentata and this idea that once upon a time it was a development, it was a superior armor. And now it's like, but mail armor comes back in Marcus Aurelius's column, for instance. It's not, lorica segmentata is not superior, it's cheaper and more mass producible and quicker to make, not better armor. And so, you'll find all these old narratives about the latest development in armor being lorica segmentata. And then the confusion about, well, why is it dropped? Why in the 3rd and 4th centuries do you have almost, universally mail and scale armor, not lorica segmentata? And muscle cuirasses are there throughout, from the 6th century BC to the 6th century AD.
So we can at least safely assume that the Romans wore the typical legionary war and auxiliary war body armor, had some type of weapon. What about the Dacians? Did they go into battle armored? Was it just their king and nobles?
Again, the problem you have in the sources is that none of the Dacians wear armor in our Roman archaeological sources. They did. Again, we find armor in the Dacian archaeology. But, they have finely wrought helmets, as, recent news is telling us, shields. And so possibly it's a wealth delineator that only the wealthiest chieftains and sub-chieftains and their bodyguard wore armor, and that the militia and the levy may not have. There's some arguments that the falx wearers were, sacred warriors, and that they would wear just trousers and bare tops. And it's very hard to make hard and fast rules that this is what it was. A lot of those sorts of arguments come from later cultures in terms of, like, for instance, the berserker. And it's very hard to definitively say that that's what's going on in this case. And so they did have armor, but it's not shown, except for, so peculiarly, the Dacian warriors are not shown wearing armor, but the victory monuments on Trajan's column and elsewhere show armor. So you'll have a Dacian helmet, Dacian armor, Dacian shields, Dacian weaponry, but you're like, well, hang on a minute, where's anyone wearing that armor? And they're not shown wearing that armor. The other peculiar thing about Trajan's column is that legionaries on Trajan's column don't do the fighting. They are never shown in combat. They are making roads, they are marching, they are building. The only soldiers who do any fighting on Trajan's column are the auxiliaries, who are in male armor.
That puts me in mind of the Battle of Mons Graupius, where Agricola, and he's in northern Britain, and only the auxiliaries
the front line is the auxiliaries,
do the fighting.
And the legionaries are in support, which is the opposite of what we normally think. And so again, that's a lovely bookend, because of course Mons Graupius 82, it's almost exactly contemporary to the Domitian's Dacian Wars. By the time of Arrian's description in the Extaxis against the Alans in 135, the legionaries are again in the front ranks and the auxiliaries support them. So you have that problem. Is it a doctrine? And very often you'll find people taking a single example of Mons Graupius, for instance, and turning it into a doctrine. Or is it an exception to a set of circumstances? It's hard to know if it's that or doctrine. And so in the Dacian Wars, obviously, they're fighting in mountainous terrain, and they're fighting continuously up against these mountaintop fortresses. Much more loose auxiliary formations would be advantageous in such cases, and the Roman legionary skill in building siege machinery absolutely could be brought to bear. Was it only ever that? Hard to say.
And the Romans realized that, the Dacians realized that they couldn't stand up to the Romans in a set-piece battle on level terrain. They would have a lot of trouble with that. Did they deliberately seek to fight in irregular terrain, in irregular formations?
So I think initially it's funny, when did they learn this lesson? Because, when you cross the Danube, it's relatively flat. You then march, and then you get to the mountains. And there's no, as far as we know, there's no combat that occurs in the flat plains, which is peculiar, because you're like, surely if you do have cavalry forces, this would be the place to show them. And so what we find in all the campaigns is that there are only a limited number of pathways through the mountains into the inner fortresses of the Dacians. You have to go through particular passes, and the Dacians mount ambushes. And as far as we know, the first against Cornelius Fuscus in 85 is successful and kills him, and we think takes a legionary standard or a signa of the Praetorian Guard. We're not sure which. And that's a successful ambush. later battles in 88 and then in 101 are Roman victories, but we have no detail. So it's like the Dacians keep that tactic, and they, know that their advantages is in attacking a marching column of the Romans. That first victory, it seems as though there were no scouts sent out ahead to tell them what was coming, and they're ambushed and surprised, and it leads to the destruction of the marching column. That's then avenged, presumably with correct procedure and using scouts and knowing what's coming. But it's the same way in all three of those campaigns. It's only in Trajan's second campaign that he finds alternative routes into Dacia for his three marching columns. The fascinating thing there is that this first campaign has overkill. It has so many legions attached to it. And the second campaign, the final one, it's like he's like, well, I don't need that many men. I need three. 3 legions will do it. I don't need 15 legions.
It's very difficult to supply as many men as he took. I think was it about 150,000
I think exactly
soldiers?
Right. I mean, he builds the bridge in between the first and second, but the bridge is used to attack Roman territory and has to be dismantled. But I think exactly right, that the logistics of supplying that many men, and by saying, right, well, I'll take much less men, means that they're almost self-contained, that they can campaign with limited supplies because they can forage and get those supplies from allies and things like that, much less onerously to those allies. Feeding 5,000 men is hard enough. Feeding 150,000 men is, you might as well not even try.
Trajan mounted his first campaign.
Yes.
And it was successful. Why then did he need a second campaign just a few years later? Why don't you tell us the stories of these two campaigns?
Of course, he wins. We think he may even get into... So he wins at this battle at Tapai. He then gets into the inner sanctum, Samosgathustra. Oh, what a word to say. And so many alternative spellings. And basically, Discipulus sues for peace. Promises that he will behave and do all sorts of... There's fascinating comments in the sources. So at the end of the Domitian's Wars, it seems as if a peace is made. There's a payment agreed from Rome to Dacia to keep them at peace, which is a common thing, but not something that Romans tend to emphasize unless it's to criticize the Roman government for agreeing to pay this stipend. What seems to happen is that the stipend is agreed to be paid and it never gets paid. And then the Dacians go, you haven't paid us our stipend, they're coming again. And the same thing happens to the Huns in the 5th century. So it's a common denominator in Roman peace terms. The Persians also get agreed to pay at various points. Now, Domitian also sends Roman engineers and military experts who we think aid Dacian engineering projects. Now, having said that, the Dacus Murus, the Dacian stonework, which is for their fortresses, which has a double wall filled with rubble, but with interlocking wooden joists to make it strong, that's not a Roman invention. That's a Dacian invention. And so the idea that expertise can't exist natively is a real problem for any civilization meeting a barbarian civilization, which is like, well, it's barbarian because you don't understand it. It's advanced, it's cultural, it's got technology, it's just not the same as yours. And so that idea that everything Dacian, which is advanced, is imported from Rome is a problem. But anyway, that's at the end of the 80s. What happens, of course, is Discipulus then builds up his forces. They're raiding, they're warlike on the border. It's not clear whether Nerva was planning on a punishing expedition into Dacia already in the 90s, but obviously he's more elderly, not military, certainly not recently, and it takes Trajan to be the younger, more energetic commander. But weirdly, he's older than Domitian was. So again, this idea of he's a young, energetic general. You're like, Domitian. Oh, no, Domitian's a wastrel. You're like, he's younger. And he had more military experience than Trajan had. Anyway, I don't want to be a Domitian apologist, but I think that, he did some horrible things, but I think a lot of that picture is false. Anyway, what was the question? Coming back to, so there are raids across the border. There are always raids across the border. We hear about some of them in the Roman sources, but they tend to have to be a bad one for us to hear about it. So, for instance, in 69, which is, the precursor to the Dacian Wars of Domitian, but, quite some time before he actually engages in them, there's the Mucianus and Domitian are marching back with vexations from 3 legions back to Italy to secure the throne for Vespasian. We have reference to a Dacian king, Scorilo, attacking across the Danube. It's one stratagem of Frontinus. And you're like, oh, hang on, there's a raid. What? More about it? No, nothing more about it. The next year, there's another raid. The governor of Moesia is killed. And so you get suggestions that, is this just always the case on the Danube frontier? Yes, because if you look at Ovid, now again, Ovid is exaggerating. Raids are constant. There is war at every corner. According to Ovid, farmers plow their fields with a sword in one hand, wearing a helmet and a plow in the other. So, they're constantly expecting raids from, rapid cavalry and archery raids from the warlike Getae and Dacians. So it seems to be a very disrupted border. Then Vespasian, Titus, and Domitian strengthen the Danubian frontier. They build forts, they add garrisons. So it could say, is this a protective measure or is this the precursor to an invasion, which again happens under Domitian? There's a peace, raids start happening again, Trajan launches a second campaign. There's a peace, there's a pattern here. Again, he gets into the central lands, and Decibelus says, oh, sorry, I promise I won't do it. They have to send back all the experts. He agrees to return deserters. Now, that's a fascinating phrase. Wait, there are people deserting from the Roman army to the Dacians, and we don't get anything more about it. But it happens on several occasions that there are men serving Rome. We don't know if it's legionaries or auxiliaries, but they leave the Roman service for the Dacian service. And similar things happen in the eastern frontier. There are deserters from the Romans to the Persians. And again, it's like, what's happening there? We don't really get any more about it. What we do know is Decibelus promises to return them and then doesn't. And so between 102, when the peace is agreed, and 106, Decibelus builds up his strength again, and sure enough, he's raiding over the border. And that leads to the second campaign. He's broken the peace. He's not met the peace terms. And so Trajan comes in peculiarly with a smaller force, but they are more destructive. They systematically take each of these 14 mountain fortresses.
And Sarmiza Gatusa, the Dacian capital, is an especially tough nut to crack.
Yes, and I think that's the interesting thing about the campaign, is that it's not the last one, but I think there's a systematic advance, because obviously if you go straight for that one and leave a fortress behind you, even if it's not got a particularly large garrison, it's a threat to your lines of supply. So I think it's also a way of practicing siege techniques. Like, let's take this first one. Right, we're getting good at this. Let's take the second one. Oh, that threw a curveball. That was something slightly different. But by the time they get to the capital, they know how to take a fortress. And so I think it is systematic. It's also interesting that the Dacians are able to escape in each case. They melt away into the forests. Again, Trajan's column shows us that. And you get this sort of deforesting by the legions as they advance, which I think is about, clearing a field before the attack to make sure there's not a way to retreat. So when the capital is taken, Decibelus is still able to escape to the north and fight a final battle. these forts are absolutely tough nuts to crack. They're all at high elevation. There's generally a single approach road which has switchbacks. They, require the building of siege weapons, which again is an interesting thing because according to these descriptions of the march, the Romans are bringing any pieces of siege equipment with them, which just adds a logistical nightmare to any march, as opposed to building them when they get there with the local timber, knowing that that's what they know, that's what they need. And I mean, the forests of Carpathia and modern Romania would provide the wood that they would need to make these siege engines. So, and interestingly, the only time that the legions are shown in combat is in a very famously on Trajan's column and copied on Marcus Aurelius's column, interestingly, is of course in a testudo formation assaulting a wall. Now, that's fascinating because according to our sources, literary sources, the testudo is never used to assault a wall. It's only ever used as a defensive formation from enemy missile assault. So here we have a testudo being marched up to the wall of a Dacian fortress. So all of that sort of suggests that there were techniques, and there's some very ambiguous structures. There's a pointed structure which we think is being described in Athenaeus Mechanicus's How to Conduct a Siege, which may have been composed for Trajan. It's all a bit vague, but I think it's possible.
This is a jigsaw puzzle in which we're missing about 80% of the pieces, and we're trying to figure out what the picture actually is.
And it's one of the problems of being a historian is that when you get a piece that might fit, to extrapolate out how might it fit is fascinating, but often long-winded and therefore very tricky to fit into a combat title. But I've done my best. My favorite phrase from 2020 was that, being me, I was over the word limit for the various sections of the text. And Nick Reynolds, the editor-in-chief, said, "Oh, you can just redeploy the text." And I redeploy text? That's a fabulous phrase. Where to? And it's like, oh, the captions. So, of course, now for this one, now I'm experienced at redeploying text for the captions. I write the captions with already redeployed text in them, which means there's no room to redeploy anything. So I've got to be far more strict with my word limits because I'm like, we're running out. I
think our listeners would probably find it very interesting to hear about the nuts and bolts of actually putting together an Osprey title.
So combat.
So tell us about that.
So combat is a title where you take one troop type versus another troop type. So in this case, Roman legionary versus Dacian warrior, and you need to concentrate on them and their role if you can. Now, obviously, there are other troop types being involved in these wars who you can't avoid mentioning, but generally you're going to try and talk about those two particular troop types, their equipment, their training, their motivation, their organization. In some cases, we know a lot. The information about the Roman legion, we know a lot about the breakdown in the armament and the equipment. The Dacians less so, but we can gather some material. Now, the problem with that is that because it's a book that's looking at both, you need to deal with them in an equal amount of words. You can't have 7,000 words on Roman legion organization and 50-word paragraph on the Dacians. So you've got to find a balance. So there's got to be things you talk about briefly and go into detail on both sides. So that balance of material, which may lead some readers to go, oh, well, he doesn't talk about this, he doesn't go into depth on this, and stuff, because I need to balance it with what we know about the other side. And in most cases in this particular volume, I've written down everything I could find about the Dacians and have had to be more brief with the Romans because there's more information about them. Once you've done that description in the first part of the book of the organization, the tactics, and you mostly, of course, will extrapolate that information out from the battle narratives that you'll be looking at in the second part of the book. In the second part of the book, you're looking at 3 battles across the span of whatever conflict campaign you're looking at. So in this case, there's one battle by Domitian. There is, which is the first one, then the second, and then the last battle by Trajan. And so in that sense, with a book where your sources are particularly uninformed, I've had to use everything available to me to make them into a battle narrative when you're dealing with, I've done one on the Gothic wars and using Ammianus Marcellinus, for instance, or the Peloponnesian wars and using Thucydides. You've got battle narratives. You've got a historian telling you what happened in the battle, or historians, what luxury. And so in a way, keeping that to the format of the book is about reducing the amount of information you include because you haven't got enough space to and it's also analysis. It's not just, this is what Thucydides says. And so you have to go, we're told this may have happened this way, another historian says this. And in this case, for the Dacian Wars, we don't have that. We don't have, we have this 6 words from Trajan. What does that mean? And so it's been extrapolating very limited literary sources on the actual campaigns and saying, well, how might this have happened? And so that's why with the first battle, for instance, in 85, there's a marching column which is ambushed by the Dacians. What would the marching column have looked like? Well, we don't have any description from these campaigns, but we do have Josephus's description of a Flavian marching column in Judea, one by Vespasian, one by Titus. What if we take that description and apply it to the army of Domitian? This is what that marching column would have looked like. This is the ambush that would have been launched. And in this case, we don't know the battle site. We've got it's here. And you're like, well, it's somewhere in this, singular valley of access into the Carpathian Mountains. So I kind of go, I think it might be here. This is an interesting blockage point. This might be where the ambush is launched from. So all of that extrapolation takes up the description of the narrative. So you have that analysis of the 3 separate battles. Of course, there are the art plates by Giuseppe Rava, which are one of a Dacian warrior front and back, one of a Roman legionary front and back, and then the second battle between Trajan's forces and the Dacians, and then the third battle, which in this case I've shown the discovery and attempt to kill himself by Decebalus, which is kind of the big moment. It's on the column and things like that. So there's a really interesting process involved in analyzing the battles. And in the last 2 combat titles that I've done, which is Marcus Aurelius's Marcomannic Wars and these Dacian Wars of Domitian and Trajan, both are limited in their literary sources for the battles and for the campaigns. And I've really enjoyed getting your teeth into what there is. The next one that I've been contracted to write is on the phalanx versus the legion. So looking at the wars of Pyrrhus and Philip II and Perseus, which is going back to the other problem. There's so much information, I have to leave stuff out. And so in this case, except with the organization of the legion, I think this Dacian Wars one has virtually everything there is. And so I quite like, and I'm quite proud of that I've jammed a lot of information into quite a short amount of text.
Then certainly this book will be an enormous contribution to the historical literature of these campaigns, because it'll be a condensation of what there is in one book, because they are difficult to wrap one's head around, because trying to get all the various pieces of information from many, many sources that don't really on their own tell you much, but together in one coherent source. That's
the other thing. I love
wonderful thing.
I love primary sources. And I do like giving you the references to where you can go and read those primary sources for yourself. And of course, then there's the secondary reading, which is, again, relatively limited, but you try and get as much of that into the bibliography as possible and direct readers to that when you can. Creating the maps from scratch about the campaigns is always useful. So hopefully it gives everyone an overview of these wars, and they can go to the source material if they need to, both secondary and primary.
Well, that's great. So from what I have gathered, let me just repeat this, that this is Murray Dahm's Roman Soldier versus Dacian Warrior, Dacian Wars AD 85 to 106, and it will be on sale by the end of February 2025. I think everybody should go out and get two copies at least.
One as a gift, absolutely.
Right, exactly. Three then. The third is a gift, and the second, just in case you spill coffee on the first,
as a coffee book,
as you're reading.
Yeah. Alienate your relatives with, you need more Dacian Wars in your life. Yes.
Who doesn't? It's number 80 of Osprey's combat series, so go out and get it. And Murray, thank you so much for joining me with this chat. Take care.
Thanks.